90% of the population are located near the city of Cayenne. Now, the only population on Devil's Island itself is actually the staff who work in the area that is now the resort. The old prison and all the guards' houses are now actually a little resort area, mostly people coming over from France. But we do have here people also who come over for the Ariane tracking, and that is for the space launches out of the Ariane in the area of French Guiana. And what happens is on the island there's a small little tracking station. When they launch one of the rockets, all the people on French Guiana have to leave the island. What they do is they send the rocket in a trajectory over the islands. And if they have to take it down, they'll blow it up right after it leaves the islands into the ocean. So no people during the rocket launches can actually be on the island itself. Now it is an island that has a little bit of a hill, it's about 131 feet in height. Very interesting, a very high literacy rate in the area of French Guiana, about 85% of the population. It's officially called the Departmente de la Guiana, Overseas Department of France. It's located northeastern coast of South America. Entire landmass of the area is 33,400 square miles. It's surrounded to the Atlantic to the north and east, Brazil to the south and east, Suriname to the west. As I mentioned, the capital of that is Cayenne. If you're there, I'll be showing you photos. Some of the wildlife you can encounter are agoutis. They are basically giant guinea pigs. You have monkeys, wild pigs, iguanas, and a vast array of all different tropical birds. The people of the mainland of French Guiana are mostly of Creole of mixed descent. Principal language is, of course, French, with an additional dialects of Creole patois, and also a local dialect with Indonesian and indigenous, and that is taki-taki. Now, the economy, very much on the upswing, and that is the European Spice Program at Kourou. It now supplies about 1/4 of French Guiana's gross national domestic product. Now it boasts one of the highest gross national products of all of South America at this time. Leading exports in this area are shrimp to Europe and the Caribbean, numerous forest products, gold, demerara rum, sugarcane, limes, bananas, tropical fruits. Now most of these fruits are sent directly over to France itself. Now originally on their first charts it was called the Triangle Islands on the early charts, although the sailors, they're the ones who started referring to the islands as the Devil's Island, being navigational hazards. With the sailing ships, the way the wind prevails in that area and also the currents, it would draw the ships towards the reef by the island. So they called them the Devil's Island passing ship. They were later renamed by an expedition. That way it was a Kourou expedition in 1783. They were then renamed the Salvation Islands. Now the individual of the islands themselves were named St. Joseph Royal. One does retain the name actually of Devil's Island. Now during the period of the French penal colonies, the Isle Royale, it held an average of well over 1,000 prisoners on the island. Today I'll show you the remains of the lighthouse, the hospital, unfortunately the children's cemetery. When I show you that, the guards were bringing over their families. And what would happen is the children were very susceptible to disease. So most of the deaths on the island were the children. Now the prisoners, if they died, they were taken out to sea and buried with their irons. And that would also be the areas all around the island where they would dump the garbage. And that was to keep the sharks all throughout the area. Now there's also a hotel, as mentioned there, and the old guard quarters. Now you'll also find, of course, the obligatory gift shop. Now Columbus, he's the first one sighted the islands in the mainland of French Guiana back in 1496. The area by 1500, you had Spaniards hearing the reports of Columbus that way. You had the first settlement, and that was done by Spain in 1503. Very interesting, in 1524, you had French merchants. They arrived at the area of Rhone in France. They were followed then by merchants from Paris, and they established the city of Cayenne, and that was back in 1643. Then in 1664, the Dutch came to the island. They took over the occupation of Cayenne. 3 years later, in the area of 1667, you had the Treaty of Breda. The Treaty of Breda awarded the entire territory back over to France, although it took them 9 years to be able to get the Dutch expelled from Cayenne. So they didn't get back in the area until 1676. Now in 1763, I mentioned the Kourou expedition. This consisted of 12,000 French colonists. They were brought all the way over from France to French Guiana, They had the promise of free land and easy money from prospecting for gold. Unfortunately, it was really no gold, and unfortunately worse, 10 of the 12,000, they died from tropical storms, floods, severe outbreaks of malaria and yellow fever. The remaining 2,000, they fled from the mainland over to the islands located only about 15 kilometers, 9 miles away to the north, and they referred to them as the Salvation or Safety Islands, hence their name. Next, the islands were then utilized as a leper colony. During this period, you had the early 18th century, France had decided what they would do and they should make use of instead of just merely shutting away from society prisoners. Now, prior to the establishment of the offshore penal colonies, many prisoners were sentenced to a life of slavery. And this was actually serving on rowing galley ships at that time. And when they were superseded by more modern means of sea travel, the French, they then constructed the prisons within the area of all the seaports around the country. At these seaports, you had the prisoners chained together in pairs. They were given an unbearable life of forced labor. France abolished slavery, and that was back in 1848. It was then decided to utilize these criminals to colonize France's overseas territories and their possessions. 1852, the French, they began using French Guiana, including the Salvation Islands and Kourou on the mainland, as penal colonies. Although the prisoners retained their French citizenship when they were brought over, the French inhabitants who had arrived prior to the prisoners and prior to the establishment of the penal colony itself, they did not gain French citizenship until 25 years later in 1877. Now, these penal colonies, they were first established during the France's Second Empire. That's under Napoleon III, and prisoners were sentenced to Devil's Islands for two reasons. One, as a way of separating the prisoners from France itself. Two, in order to populate French Guiana, and then later in the South Pacific, Noumea, with settlers. Very interesting, when a prisoner was sent over, that way, they were required that way to serve on the sentence. Let's say you had a 5-year sentence. You had to serve a 5-year sentence, then you had to stay 5 more years living on the mainland of French Guiana. So you had double the amount of your sentence in that way. So once the sentence completed, you had to live there. They were not paid any money at all for reparation back to France finishing the sentence. Now, if anyone received a sentence of 8 years, it was considered 8 years or more, it was a death sentence. From the area 1852 right to 1939, you had over 80,000 French convicts were sentenced to the penal colonies of French Guiana. Out of that, only 30,000 ever arrived back alive to France. The horrors of the penal colonies became widely known in the rest of the world. That was in 1906. You had the negative publicity surrounding the plight of a Jewish French army captain, Alfred Dreyfus. He was wrongly accused of treason and sentenced to the penal colonies of Devil's Island. Dreyfus, with few friends amongst his brother officers, was convicted back in 1894 for supplying Germany with military secrets. As a Jew, and therefore at that time an alien in France, Dreyfus was the ideal suspect. Unlike the real traitor, his name was Ferdinand Esterhazy. You had a writer, very prominent at that time, Émile Zola. He prominent that way. He petitioned France for years to get Dreyfus's conviction overturned. Unfortunately, Zola was then tried for libel. He actually had to free France at that time, and he died really without ever seeing his cause vindicated. Now, in a very convoluted way, many historians now feel these events were the catalyst for the Jewish state of Israel. For the newspaper reporter who was assigned from Vienna, Austria, to cover the trial, and that was the trial, once again, of Captain Dreyfus, his name was Theodor Herzl, who just 3 years later, in 1897, propelled forth the Zionist movement. It is said that the unfairness of the trial, it made Herzl realize that European Jews would never be able to assimilate into European culture at that time. Now, following his false conviction, Captain Dreyfus spent over 4 years in solitary confinement on Devil's Island, April of area 1895 to July of 1899. Dreyfus was the first prisoner ever confined to Devil's Island. What had they done? They burnt down part of the area where the leper colony was. There was no prisoners on there. And what they did is they took everything apart. They constructed a single room as this prison, 3.65 meters by 3.65 meters, 12 foot by 12 foot. There was an adjoining guard room of 1.8 meters, 6 feet by 2.7 meters, 9 feet. The armed guard relieved every 2 hours from Royale. They ran a cable over. And on this cable, they could take a bucket with the gentleman standing in it and supplies, and they moved it from the island to the other island. So there was only 2 people always on Devil's Island that way. Now, they were forbidden. Any guard was not allowed to converse with Dreyfus at all, and he couldn't even acknowledge him in any way, shape, and form. Therefore, Dreyfus, 4 years, was not allowed to converse freely with anyone. In his 4 years of confinement, it is said that was documented, that he had many imaginary conversations with his wife. Now, upon his release, Captain Dreyfus was returned to France. Unfortunately, upon his arrival, he was once again charged with treason. It took 6 more years for his name to be cleared by presidential pardon. He was rehabilitated to the rank of major, but unfortunately, his more than 4 years that way of solitary confinement at Devil's Island, it left him permanently mentally scarred. It's only as recent, 1998, the then President Chirac of France, he apologized in the name of France to the descendants of Dreyfus for the dark stain unworthy of our nation. Now, here we go to Papillon. The beginning of Papillon, name Papillon, by the way, denotes the butterfly tattoo on the gentleman Henry Charrier. You'll hear the famous quote, "Welcome to the penal colony of French Guiana, whose prisoners you are, and for which there is no escape." Truth is, many did escape. Only a few ever lived to actually tell about it. Convicts who were sent to the penal colonies of French Guiana, they toiled under inhumane conditions. Many worked to death on the mainland of French Guiana. They were felling trees there, constructing road. Understand, this was carried out in the ever-present tropical heat and humidity, the constant threats of malaria, yellow fever, the snakes, and many, many Moroni River crocodiles. Convicts who fell behind on their work quotas, they had their meager daily rations cut even further. Therefore, they would fall into a death spiral from weakness and fatigue. Convicts who were caught trying to escape were sentenced to at least 200 lashes. These lashes had to be administered while the convict was awake. So if they passed out from the pain, they waited till they woke back up to finish the lashes. Workers who were caught shirking on their duties, they were actually stripped naked, covered with molasses, and laid on top of a fire ant hills in front of their fellow prisoners. Now, inmates who died on the island, as I mentioned, they were buried at sea. They were buried wearing their irons and chains for weights. Those who did escape and eventually were recaptured would then be subject to solitary confinement, forced to wear shackles and irons 24 hours a day, also receiving extra years to their original sentence. Therefore, they lost any hope of ever being able to return to France at the end of their term on Devil's Island. Inmates had 2 different ways of attempting escape. They could travel by boat along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, or they could try to make their way inland to the mainland through the mainland of French Guiana. The crocodiles of Moroni River ultimately confronted those who attempted to try to go through the mainland. You had unknown numbers attacked and killed by these crocodiles while trying to cross the river. Now, many accounts previously had put this to be piranhas. There is not one documented case of a piranha ever actually eating a person. What happens? The crocodiles take the bite, and the piranhas will come in and they clean up. Now, one escape you've heard of, aforementioned, Henry Charrier, Papillon. His book was published in 1970, made into a movie in 1973. Now, as a movie would have you believe that he did escape from Devil's Island, but he actually escaped from the capital of Cayenne in the mainland. If you look at the movie, they have him on the mainland, and at the very end on the island. It was exactly opposite. You were on the island for your sentence, and then when you were done, you were living on the mainland. So he was living on the mainland that way. Now, he was most hated prisoner, especially by other prisoners after his book came out. His many previous attempts that he wrote in his book of accounts were actually accounts of other prisoners' escapes on that way by the previous inmates. The prison life that he describes in the book was stories told him about the prison life in the penal colonies at a period 20 years earlier. But as Hollywood says, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. One person who did survive, and I recommend the book very, very much. His name is Rene Belenois. He penned a book called Dry Guillotine, 15 Years Amongst the Living Dead, published in 1938. Dry guillotine was a term used by the prisoners, because the island life is a dry guillotine. It's going to kill you, but it's not going to draw the blood. Now, Belenois, after his escape from Devil's Island, he made his way through the jungles of South and Central America. He even stayed for 7 months with local Kuna Indians in Panama. He then traveled all the way through to Central America and to Mexico. Eventually, he made his way all the way into the area of Los Angeles. Now, his time in the prison and his time on the journey, it made him so emancipated and weak. His weight was less than 100 pounds, and due to the poor medical conditions, by the time he reached Los Angeles, he lost every one of his teeth. When he got to Los Angeles, he published the book once again, Dry Guillotine, in 1938. 1940, he wrote a second book, and that is Hell on Trial. Now, he did hold the tourist visa once he arrived that way, but he was told to leave the U.S. in 1941. He moved to Mexico. He was later caught in 1942 in Brownsville, Texas, trying to sneak back into the United States. He was sentenced to 15 months in prison. Now, upon his release, he did gain a U.S. passport. He went back to Los Angeles. He actually went to work for Warner Brothers, and he actually was a technical advisor on the film Passage to Marseille. He married in 1951 and moved an area to the area of Lucerne Valley. He had a son there. He passed away in 1959, 59 years of age, very proudly a U.S. citizen. But the whole interesting thing was the whole time he was in both the States and Mexico, France had continually petitioned for his extradition back to France. Both the United States and Mexico would not allow that to happen. Now, his books were very instrumental in exposing the life and the inhumane conditions on the prison colony. Now, also, the year of 38, the same year as the first book was released, the French government stopped sending prisoners to Devil's Island. It was back in 1952, the last prison was left the island, the prison ceased operation. And very interesting, besides the area of Captain Alfred Dreyfus and Rene Belenois, it is credited very highly with the Salvation Army getting the penal colonies closed by exposing the life of the penal colony themselves. To me, it's quite a conundrum. These islands, they started out as a sanctuary for French colonists, then became a notorious leper colony, then the famous penal colony of French Guiana. Now we have people who risk their linen life to try to get out of it, and now over 50,000 tourists a year come flocking to the area. So here we are. That is the islands themselves. That is Royale, Devil's Island, St. Joseph's. You're going to see a beautiful, beautiful tropical islands. Now, when the prisoners are on there, they're mostly denuded. And they were denuded that way to make sure they couldn't try to hide and escape. So this is Isle Royale. This is where you had the majority, over 1,000 prisoners, the hospital, the insane asylum. You had also the lighthouse. You had solitary confinement. So here it is looking out. There's the lighthouse. Now that is the area of the guards' quarters. There are now people coming over staying in for hotel rooms. That I'll show you a little more. That was the area of the pool. That was a private pool for the person running the prison. He had it done by hand labor. So here we are coming up. That's the power plant for the island. The area you see up was the Commandant's house. That is now a small museum. So here we are walking up. That is looking over to St. Joseph. And there's turtles all around the island. They were a very big meat source along with the agutes. They have a path. You can walk around the entire island. So here we are going to walk up to the Commandant's house. It's now a museum. And it is very interesting to go in. That is the chains and irons. If you look at the weight of that to have to walk around, and then also when I show you the buildings, if you look, the buildings have rails. And a lot of the times, one arm for the ones that way working in the galley, they would be taken and kept wearing the irons to the wall so they couldn't try to escape. Burying the dead at sea, you see the sharks around. They also took all the garbage off different areas in the island to keep the sharks around. That is the photo that made me really start thinking. That is Captain Alfred Dreyfus after his 4 years of solitary confinement. He went, got onto the launch, turned around, and saluted the guards who held him for 4 years. I would have saluted. It would have been with one finger. Now here's the flora and fauna. You have here your termite mounds. They're all over the place. That's the Commandant's Pool. That was a hard labor project. That's your little agouti in the background. They're part of the guinea pig family, also called bushmeat in many of the islands down there. Here's the church. The church was decorated by the prisoners. So when you go into the church, all the artwork is from different prisoners. Here's the hospital and the insane asylum in ruins. And then here, that's the space loss tracking. There's one building. So as you're coming by the area, that is where they will sit, get the people off the island, and that traces a trajectory, and they can also explode the rocket over. Here's the kitchen. So you can see the rails, how they could actually have people actually connected to the walls. The graveyard, unfortunately, as I mentioned, it is mostly the children. The families were brought over, and you can see how small these graves are. They have the morgue. This is where the bodies would be held to the prisoners that were taken out to sea. You have more of the beautiful fauna. There you go. You have your monkeys. My little squirrel monkey. You have here wild pigs on the island. Now the guard quarters is now a hotel. So here, all those palm trees are gone. When I was here with the Small Royal, it was one of the old Renaissance ships years ago, that was taken. We came back after visiting the Amazon, there were no palm trees left. What had happened, one of the French tourists was hit in the head and killed instantly by a coconut. So they denuded that. More people are killed with items falling out of trees than drown in the water. Here's a solitary confinement. There's a little wall area. You can see here how small the rooms are, how bare. That is a little hospital. And once again, you can see they would be chained both with feet and hands in this, that way against the wall. That's the latrine. So here is your gift shop. But also this is where you can see Devil's Island. So if you come in, that is the viewing area. That is Devil's Island. So picture a cable going across. Double cable, they would move the guards every 2 hours, and there was only the guard and Dreyfus ever on that island, other than before that the lepers. And then here's beautiful flora and fauna, your agoutis, peacocks. I am so happy to tell you my last time there, he is gone. I asked the woman who runs the aspect of the restaurant. He said he figured out how to pick the lock and he flew away. So he escaped. You have here your macaws. Now their wings aren't clipped. They'll just keep feeding them and they just keep coming back. This is something that I will never forget in my life. I'm out, I go feed the monkeys. So I had bananas. I went by, there was a flock of parrots up in the tree. So I broke open a banana. That one hopped down, took the banana in my hand, looked me square in the eyes. I went, "You're cuckoo." He went, "Cuckoo." It had to be either a guard's or a prisoner's pet that went back and flew. He finished the banana and just hopped away. There is some of the beautiful flora. Now this really got me when one of the people working there told me about this. They built the reservoir. It was a hard labor project. That is beautiful hard stone. It's absolutely interesting when you look at it. You can see that they were given tools to make the reservoir. Spoons. So that was dug out completely by spoon. Here's all your iguanas, your skinks. So all that was hand dug by spoons. So here, to me, it's very interesting. As I mentioned, people try to go back. But I'm just going to go very quick on history of coffee. How many here like coffee? Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little story. It's about Caldi. And what happens is, that way, he lived in the period about 750 AD. He was a goat herder. And what happens is, he was in what we now call the Ethiopian homelands. There's a Ethiopian map. Now here, and it's the province of Kaffa. and have about today 5,000 different types of Arabica coffee trees still grow today. They have for centuries. Now, whether this legend bears some truth, I don't know, but to me, most legends do have a small grain of truth, and I think it is the same with Kaldi. It is said that Kaldi, after tending with his goats started eating these red berries, and what happens is they became that way, very rambunctious. They were jumping around, dancing, and he did not fall asleep that night. He was so scared that he would wake up in the morning and the goats would be dead. He thought it was a poison that made him react that way. And with him that way, he noticed the flock didn't suffer any negative effects at all from consuming these berries on a very glossy leaf tree. So he reported his findings to the local monastery, the abbot. Now, the abbot, he said, bring me some of these berries. The abbot, after experimenting with the berries, made a drink from them. He discovered that it did keep him alert for the long hours of his evening prayers. Soon the abbot, he started sharing the discovery with other monks in the monastery, and ever so slowly you had the energizing effects of the berries began to spread outside the region. Now, as this news of a new elixir moved to the east, coffee then reached the area of the Arabian Peninsula. It began a journey which would spread the reputation around the globe. Now, by the 13th century, you had coffee becoming such an extremely popular beverage with the Muslim community due to its stimulus power. It also proved for them very successful in the long prayer process. Soon, the Arabs, they began parching and boiling the coffee berries. That is a live berry, but when you roast them or you boil them that way, you kill them from actually being able to take root. So what happens, the Muslims are able to control the coffee. They never ever gave coffee in any shape or form other than boiling the coffee berries that way. They were able that way to corner the entire market on the coffee crop. Now, this new beverage was not only drunk in Arabian homes, but also it started public coffee houses. They were called Qavam Kana, and began to appear upon cities all throughout the Near East. The popularity of the houses was unequal. People, they started frequenting them not just for the coffee, but also for social activity that took place with it. They would engage in conversation, they'd listen to music, watch performers, play chess, and they also just kept up on the current events of the day. These quickly became a very important center for exchange of information. The coffee houses were then referred to by many as the schools of the wise. Each year, you had thousands of pilgrims coming in from all over the world. They were visiting the holy city of Mecca, and they called it the wine of Araby. And this drink was then beginning to spread due to this all over Arabia. Now, to maintain its monopoly on the early coffee trade, they continued, the Muslims, to closely guard their coffee production and kept a great tight control on the area. By the 15th century, coffee is grown in the Yemeni district of Arabia. It's been there today. The coffee that still grows there right now, when I looked it up about, gotta be 2 years ago now, it goes for about $200 per pound. And by the 16th century, you had the coffee now in Persia, Egypt, Syria, and Turkey. It is thought, though, that not one living plant existed outside of Arabia or Africa until the area of the 1600s. And that's in Baba Budan. Baba Budan was an Indian pilgrim. He was able to hide 7 fertile coffee berries in his beard. He brought it back to India, but they did not grow. Now, you had the demand during this period of coffee truly beginning to spread. There was a tense competition to cultivate coffee outside of the Arabian and African areas. Now, you had the coffee of the Dutch. Though the Arabs, they were trying hard to maintain the monopoly of coffee. They only did the processed beans exporting. And they did that from the port, by the way, of Mocha on the Red Sea. It was the Dutch who, in the area of the late 15th century, they succeeded in actually smuggling out live seedlings. Now, the Dutch, they first attempted to also plant these in India. That venture was not successful. Then in 1616, the Dutch founded what was the area of the first European-owned coffee estate, and that was in Sri Lanka. And then they went into Ceylon. In 1696, they expanded into Batavia, the island of Java, and of now the area we call Indonesia. Now the coffee that thrived there, it soon was a very productive trade for the Dutch with coffee. They expanded the area of their cultivation to the islands of Sumatra, Celebes. They became very quickly the prominent force in the coffee trade. Now the Dutch, that all changed for them in 1714. And it all happened with a gift. What had happened, the mayor of Amsterdam was presented a gift of a young coffee plant, and that was by King Louis XIV, France. Now he was such a prolific coffee drinker, King Louis XIV, and he combined it with cloves, cardamom seeds, and sugar. The king, he ordered that way the plant to go over, and what happens is it was planted in the Royal Botanical Garden in Paris. So you have it now growing in Paris. A young naval officer, very smart, 1723, he was going over to Martinique. He asked the king, can I get the seeds of this plant and plant it in Martinique? They didn't want to have it go over that way. So what happens is, the young officer, he bribed the royal physician. He was given some of the fresh seedlings, and despite a very arduous voyage, complete with a Tunisian pirate attack, French saboteur, who was put on by the king to make sure that it didn't get onto the area of Martinique. They also hit a very bad tropical storm. They jettisoned almost all their cargo off the ship except the seedlings themselves. He managed to transport these seedlings to Martinique. Once planted in, as King Louis XIV, once planted in Martinique, the seedlings there survived greatly. Over the next 50 years, there were 18 million coffee plants in the area of Martinique. It's also from the French area of Martinique that the coffee plants spread to the Caribbean, South, and also Central America. We all think of Brazil about coffee. This is how it did come to Brazil. It did come in the hands that way from the area of French Guiana. You had here a coffee that way, a gentleman called Melo de Pereta. He was a Brazilian, and he was sent by the emperor to French Guiana. And what he was sent there for, obtaining coffee seedlings. The French, they were not willing to share it all. Pelea was very unsuccessful in his adventure, except he was so handsomely engaging, they say, that he won over the charms of the governor's wife. She presented him with a large bouquet of flowers for his travels home. Inside the flowers were live coffee berries. So he was able to get back. He returned to Brazil that way. And then, very interesting, it started with now billions of dollars in that way. Now by this time, coffee established itself as a commodity in the 17th century around throughout the world. Missionaries, travelers, traders, colonists, they continued to carry coffee seeds to new lands. Coffee trees were planted worldwide. You had the plantations, they were established on tropical forests, also the rugged mountain highlands. Now some flourished while others short-lived. Even new nations were established on coffee economies, fortunes made and lost at that time. Now, there were opponents of this new beverage, overly cautious. Some called it the bitter invention of Satan. When coffee arrived in Venice, 1615, the local clergy condemned it. Now, the controversy surrounding the new beverage soon became so great that the then Pope, that was Pope Clement VIII, he asked to intervene. Before deciding, however, he decided to taste the beverage for himself. He found the drink so satisfying, he declared, "The devil's drink is delicious. We should cheat the devil by baptizing it." Now, despite the controversy in the major cities of England, Austria, France, Germany, and Holland, coffee houses were quickly becoming the centers of social activity and communications also. In England, you had what they call penny universities coming up. These did so because the price of a penny, one could purchase a cup of coffee, engage in very stimulating conversation. By the mid-17th century, you had over 300 coffee houses in London alone, many which attracted different patrons with common interests, such as merchants, shippers, brokers, and artists. Many businesses grew from these coffee houses. There is one you might have heard of. There was Edward Lloyd's Coffee House. We now refer to it as Lloyd's of London. And it started out of a coffee house itself. But not all were happy once again with the new beverage. Many of the women in London, they tried in vain to ban the new, that they said, drying, enfeebling liquor. Now you have here coffee coming to the area of the United States. Mid-1600s, the Dutch, they exported coffee to their new settlement called New Amsterdam, later called New York by the British. By the time of the 13 colonies, very few coffee houses were springing up, none really operating successfully. Tea continued to be the favorite drink of the colonists. Now this all did change on December 16th, 1773. You had the colonists revolting against the heavy tax on tea. That was done by King George. The revolt we know today as the Boston Tea Party, and that would forever change the American drinking preference to coffee. By the end of the 18th century, coffee had become one of the world's most profitable export crops. It was a worldwide commodity. Entrepreneurs that began looking for new ways to profit from this beverage. Now the Civil War, along with other conflicts, followed, and this helped increase coffee consumption, but many of the soldiers had relied on the coffee for a boost of energy in the battles. Then 1864, you had brothers John and Charles Arbuckle. They were from Pittsburgh. That gentleman by Jabez Burns, he had invented a new machine. It was a self-emptying coffee bean roaster, and they purchased this and made a fortune with it. Now, the same years as the Arbuckle began, you had that way. The Arbuckles, they started selling pre-roasted coffees in paper bags by the pound. They named their coffee Arosia, and that found great success. They were selling it to the cowboys of the American West. A gentleman you might have heard of the name today, James Folger, he followed suit by selling the gold miners in California his coffee. Now this blazed a trail for many other big name producers. Of course, today we have Maxwell House, Hills Brothers, all others. But the one who really started coffee in its popularity is a gentleman, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt himself was counted amongst America's great coffee drinkers. He is rumored to drink 1 gallon of coffee a day. Now also, he is credited with something you remember on TV years ago, Maxwell House famous, good to the last drop. What happened? He was served coffee, Roosevelt, at Andrew Jackson's historical home, the Hermitage in Tennessee, and he actually said that, and they actually penned that right after he said it. Now, by the time you had the area of the 1960s, the demand of higher quality coffee really began to grow. 1971, one company really recognized the chance of making a profit on the new demand for a higher end beverage. That, of course, you see there is Starbucks. Today, you can find numerous small independent-owned cafes, many boasting now sustainable, locally roasted, fair trade coffee beans. Now, it has evolved into a beverage now that is valued for its complexity of flavors, aromas. Today, it's almost judged just like a wine would be judged. Now, it has grown around the world even today. But if you pick up your next stop, just think of a little coffee aspect of a gentleman out with a herd of goats, Cowley, and watching the goats, and that's where it all began in the Ethiopian highlands. Just a quick little thing on coffee. Thanks, folks.